Good afternoon and welcome to our Capability Accelerator program. And today, the first in our Marketing Masterclass sessions. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. And for me, this is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islanders people who might be joining us on today's webinar. I'm Collins Rex, and I'm the lead for the Victorian METS Export Hub, and I will be your presenter for today's session. Let's have a look at what we're going to be covering off today. Quite a full program, so a fair bit to get through, but I'm sure we'll find time to take questions along the way as we go. So today it's all about international marketing strategy, starting off with key considerations for your international marketing, marketing planning, international marketing strategy, the marketing mix, and specifically for the METS sector, marketing activity, budgeting and measuring for success, and finally, as I said, some time for questions. So let's get straight into it. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box, and I'll keep half an eye on that as we go along and take the questions as we do, and if they're appropriate. Otherwise, we'll take them at the end. So starting with international marketing, what exactly is international marketing? Well, of course, it's all the tactics and methods that you use to market your products and services in multiple countries. And this can be in the form of direct export, franchising, licensing, online sales, etc., and even B2B e-commerce. Of course, the key here is that every marketing strategy for every single market is going to be different. It's almost impossible to apply the same principles and the same strategy in every single market. Before you even embark on that marketing drive, and for those of you who are new to export or are still thinking of exporting, before you embark on any international business activities, you need to consider whether your company is in fact ready to sell overseas and everything that goes with that. You need to know if you have the resources, the manpower, the contacts, the capability, and the market penetration. Is your product something that's going to have universal appeal to minds in markets other than Australia? Will you need to adapt what you do to suit the needs in other markets? And of course, if you are selling more than one product, if you have a number of different services that you offer, on which ones will you focus in which markets? You can't start planning a strategy until you have a very clear understanding of the actual market into which you are going to be selling your products. And that means you need to understand the cultural differences in those markets. Buying decisions are made differently from one market to another. You need to understand how customs, traditions, and business practices are going to play to either your strengths or indeed play up your weaknesses. What are the economics in the market that you're thinking about? Is it a booming market? Is it the sort of market where social activity is such that a call for products that require minerals, for example, is booming and therefore the market is going to be booming along with it? Or is there potential for recession? You need to understand the laws from country to country. So what do you have to do, for example, when it comes to product design standards? If you are selling vehicles into a particular mine, do you have to modify them in a specific way for them to comply? Also understand that by complying to Australian design rules, you may in fact be contravening regulations in certain markets, like the USA, for example. You also need to understand the politics in the market. What is the political stability like? How are the sanctions regimes being applied, both national and international? What are the costs to do business in that market, and how does that impact the price point at which you need to be selling? Are there specific taxes that are being applied to businesses such as yours and goods and services such as yours? What are the demographics in the countries, of course? And you might think, well, I'm selling into a mine. Does it matter what the country population is like? Absolutely, it does. So if, for example, you look at the median age of the population in the African continent, in 2020, it was just under 20 years of age. Why does that matter to you? Well, it has all sorts of implications for staff availability over time, for example, and it also changes the way in which the general population purchases. So before you make any decisions and before you start your marketing drive, always ask, in a particular market, do they want it? Can they afford it? And can and may I supply it? And then, of course, you can start your marketing activities. You need to start with a thorough SWOT analysis. And please, when you do the SWOT, be honest and be realistic about your strengths and your weaknesses and those of your products or services in a particular market. And also be realistic about the opportunity that exists in that market and indeed the threats. And of course, understand that strengths can be weaknesses and vice versa. And similarly, threats can be opportunities. So in your target market, you need to understand the demographics, you need to understand an environmental and industry analysis, and you need also to understand what is going to happen in that market when you enter it, because that is going to fundamentally affect the way in which you market yourself. You also need to have a really good handle on your customers. So exactly who is your target customer and how does that target customer behave? What are the values and the needs of your target customers? What are the wants of your target customers? And of course, there are differences between what they need and what they want. What are the future prospects in that market? Where within the market are your customers located? There's no point in having a marketing drive that focuses on a capital city in a market when the mines that you're actually aiming at are in the regions. And that is almost always the case. Of course, you might be aiming at the head offices that could be in the capital cities. So you need to understand where the customer is to whom you are actually marketing your product and your services. And where do those customers get their information? Do they depend purely on word of mouth or indeed direct contact with you and other potential suppliers? Or do they visit blog sites, for example, to get background information? Do they have access to specific industry publications, for example, and that's how they get their information? If you market into the wrong channel, you're going to be wasting your money. Also, think about your customers' customers. So who are they and what do they want and for how long are they going to want it? Because that is going to determine how you sell to your customers. It's also very important to understand the competition in a market because, again, that is going to inform your marketing strategy. So who is the competition? What size is the companies against whom you are competing? How long have they already been in that market? What is their market share? And what do you have to do to get a slice of that pie? What are their unique selling propositions and their value propositions? And how are you going to position yourself against what they have already established? Do they have a good reputation in market? If they do, it's going to be difficult to take them on. You're going to have to be clever about that. If their reputation is not so great, it opens a gap for you in the market. What are their strengths and their weaknesses? So do a SWOT analysis on the competition. And of course, you need to understand how the competition is marketing, because the channels they use will be an indication of the ones that you will probably need to use as well. However, you might make a decision consciously to not use the same channels as your competitors as a point of difference, but you still need to understand what they do. Now, there are some tools out there, and a very handy tool is one called Competitor Spy FX, which allows you to monitor and analyze your competitors' advertising campaigns. And you can see the address on the screen there. And of course, we will make the slides available to you after the fact, so you don't need to write this down. Very important in any METS activity that you undertake is that you do a pestle analysis. And that means doing an analysis of the political environment, the economic, the socio-cultural, the technological, the environmental, and the legal implications of entering a market. Now, we've covered this in some detail in our market selection series, so I don't think we need to go over it here, but be aware that you need to do this. So let's move on now to the international marketing strategy that you need to think about. So first of all, you need to set your objectives very clearly when it comes to implementing any sort of marketing strategy and entering any market with a thought through marketing campaign. So before you determine that strategy, you need to know what it is that you're aiming to achieve through your marketing. And that means you need to have an effective and an accountable way to define your objectives. And one of the methods that works really well is the SMART method, which means that your objectives need to be specific, they need to be measurable, they need to be achievable, they need to be realistic, and they do need to be timely. So let's look at a couple of examples of SMART objectives. You might, for example, have a profitability objective, which could look something like achieving a 20% return on the capital that you've employed in a particular market by a specific date like March 2023. If your objective is a market share objective, again, it needs to be very clear and very well established. So you might, for example, want to gain 15% of the market for mine air conditioning systems in Peru by July 2024. It's clear, it's concise, and it is actually measurable. In the case of a branding objective, you might set out to make yourself the preferred brand of safety boots for miners in Sudbury in Canada by April 2024. Now that should give you a pretty clear idea of how your objectives need to be established. You need to make them very clear to yourself. They need to be measurable, and you need to be able to track them against expenditure. Now, your marketing strategy is the overall strategy you need to position yourself within your chosen market, but not just positioning yourself in isolation, positioning yourself in order to meet your customers' needs. So your goal needs to be to differentiate yourself from your competitors so that your customers choose your business over theirs. Now, that's a bit of a no-brainer, really, but it's not quite as simple as it might seem. The specific elements that make up your marketing strategy are typically referred to as the marketing mix, also known as the Ps, and we'll be covering this off in more detail. Each element, of course, is varied, and it plays into broadening the appeal of your products and services, and each P is going to have a direct impact on your sales. Now, when it comes to the mining sector, there are some core marketing concepts that you need to note. We don't need to go through these line by line, and again, you will get the slides, but it's very important that in this sector, almost more so than just about any other, you need to understand the needs, wants, and demands of your customer. You need to understand what your target markets are, your positioning in that market, and your segmentation in that market. You need to understand what it is that you need to be offering and the brands that you need to be publicizing. Value and satisfaction, key propositions. Which marketing channels are you going to use? And also bear in mind that a lot of what you're going to do in this sector is going to be face-to-face marketing. You need to have a very good handle on your supply chain, and that means end to end, from your inputs to your outputs, the entire supply chain. Competition, what is that like? Marketing environment, so what exactly is acceptable in your environment from a marketing perspective? And then, of course, you have to adequately plan. And that brings us to the marketing mix. And we all know the 4 Ps, the standard 4 Ps of marketing. Well, the 4 Ps in recent years have expanded into 7, and the 7 are not the same for every single sector. Every sector has a slight tweak and understands the Ps a little bit differently. So today we're going to look specifically at the 7 Ps of METS marketing. And in the case of METS, the 7 Ps are principle, product, price, place, which of course are almost standard, promotion, people, positioning, and packaging. And here we understand packaging very differently from that of packaging in consumer products. So in the case of principle, it's an explanation, and we'll get to this in more detail. Product, literally the item, the service, the product that you offer. Price, you need to be charging enough to make a profit, but not too much for the market to bear. Place, the distribution channels, the places through which your customers get access to your goods or services. Promotion, how you communicate the existence of your product and service, and very importantly, its benefits. People, both your staff and your customers. Positioning, your brand or your corporate identity, and packaging, which is your brand packaging. So let's look at them each individually. In the case of principle, literally, what is your product and service? And how do you explain it in a way that is clear enough for your customer to understand what exactly it is that you're offering? So also important, what is the value of that product or service to the miner? You need to understand alignment, and you need to understand how you fit into the mining company's innovation priorities. And this is both centralized and decentralized. And you also need to understand how you play to their wants and needs right now, so in the near term and in the longer term, because you really do need to be looking at this from a longevity perspective. You also need to have a relevant and a meaningful narrative, so a story that validates your value proposition and your claims. And you need to think cleverly about the way in which you communicate with your customers. And very importantly, you need to have use cases that you can demonstrate. In the case of product, a few questions that you need to be asking yourself. What does the market need? So what does your specific mining customer need, but what does the market as a whole need in that particular sector? And very importantly too, what does the market want, which is not always the same thing. What are your unique selling or your value propositions? And more often than not, the value proposition is a more important one to have very clearly enunciated than the selling proposition. It's all about focusing on satisfying your customers' needs and wants while still meeting your business objectives. So very much a case of, if you will buy it to your customer, we will make it within reason. You need to be flexible, you need to consider adaptations, and those will vary by market. So those changes to product designs, it might be as simple as needing to change the color of a piece of equipment so that it works in a particular mining environment. Specifications, sizes, the way in which things operate, etc. If it's a vehicle, is it left-hand drive, right-hand drive, or does it need to have dual controls? Any manuals that you have that go along with your products, do they have to be translated? Do they have to be set out in a different way? If you're working in a market, for example, in the Middle East, you might have to change everything to read from right to left rather than left to right. Also think about factors like your brand reputation in a particular market and how that is already perceived by the time you enter that market. And of course, also the reputation of the state of Victoria in this case, and the reputation of Australia. We have a huge marketing advantage in Australia because we are recognised as leaders in mining and we are recognised as leaders in METS. So you've already got an advantage over competitors that might come from a market with a lesser reputation. Also, think about those competitor products and their reputation. The next P is price. And of course, price is a very important factor. And even though price comes very low down the scale of negotiation, it's pretty much the last thing that you negotiate with your customer. It is a very important concept for you to have a grasp of. You need to understand what your customer in that market will pay, and then you need to know what you can afford to charge. You might find that your lowest possible price is still too high for the market and for what that market will bear. If that's the case, you probably need to think about going to a different market or finding a different way to sweeten the deal. Main pricing models, and again, you know how you price. We really don't have to go into this, but the most basic of all is cost plus. Everything that it costs you to produce a product or a service plus a margin. Demand-based, what the market will pay depending on supply versus demand, and marginal costing, taking into account variable costs, but really ignoring those fixed and overhead costs. And there is a myriad of other pricing models. You will use the one that is best for your business, your product, your service, but you need to understand how you price and why you price in the way you do, and how that positions you in the market that you're considering. You also need to be prepared as part of your early POC demonstration to commit and to clarify preferred pricing. So if you have got a customer that has allowed you to come in and set up a demonstration on site, you might have to change your pricing for that customer compared to the general market. And also do not lose sight of what you have to do after the sale, because that will impact your price as well. After sales service, warranties, any maintenance that you might have to do on your products, and of course the impact on future pricing and also future relationships. The next of the P's is place. So where will your products be seen? Where will they be made? Where will they be sold, and how will they reach the end customer? When it comes to services, very much the same principle, but here we're also talking about support and by whom will they be supported. So think about the location. There are often extreme conditions involved in any mining location. How does that affect the way in which you promote your product and play up the way it works in that market? Also, the way in which your product will be used, which may not always be the way that you intended it to be used. So make sure you cover that off in your marketing. Take into account any regulations that may stop you exporting or being imported into a particular market, or indeed may affect the way in which you are allowed to promote what you do. Also think about those barriers to entry, which might affect the marketing strategy you employ and the logistics of literally getting your product onto a mine site. Next off, promotion. Of course, this is all about making the potential customer aware of your existence, of the existence of your products and your services, and the benefits of your products and services to them. These are all the activities you use to make your customers aware of what you do. And this includes advertising, promotions, direct marketing, including visits to market, social media, which are being used increasingly, even in sectors as very specific and technical as mining. Also think about what you're good at. You might not be equally good at every promotional activity. You might have really good cut through when you visit your customers and you speak to them face to face, but you might find that you're actually not so great on the social media side because you really don't have time to maintain a blog, for example. You might also struggle with advertising. Maybe you don't quite get the imagery right, or there are other reasons why your advertising doesn't quite work. So play to your strengths. Also understand what you are allowed to do in a specific market. You may not be allowed to advertise, for example, or your customers might be in a sector that is so sensitive that you would prefer not to advertise that you are working in that sector. Also know what it costs to promote, and again, know what your competition is doing. So a few things to be across when you are promoting your products and your services into the mining sector. Always provide key points and values. The quicker the customer understands the advantages that you offer, the sooner they'll be likely to engage in serious purchasing discussions. Give detailed information. Every level of your product needs to have details, and this will really make it a lot easier for you at the end of the day, because your customers will have confidence that you understand their needs and how your products and services meet those needs. Unify your messages across all platforms. So if you are in various marketing channels, make sure that the same messaging is going through them all. So whether it is advertising, whether you have social media presence, whether you are in an expo, for example, have the same messaging and the same branding throughout. It just makes it far less confusing for your customers. Put a face on your product and your service. So you have things that you produce, but those things are produced by people. And if you put a face to the product and the service, you make it relatable and you make it far easier for your customer to connect with you. Also consider partnering with other brands and products. Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily co-promote something, but you might, for example, co-author a paper, or you might do a project with a university. You might release an on-site video with your customer if they are comfortable for you to do that. And then we get to people. So the people is your staff and your customers. Your staff drives your marketing and your customer service, and you need to make sure that you have the right people with the right skill sets and experience to both service the needs of your customers and to gain an understanding of your chosen market. And that includes things like language ability, cultural ability, etc. Also, understanding your customers. And this means you need to identify the right people to whom you are communicating your message. Dealing with the procurement officer at a particular mine might not be the right way to go. You might actually need to be dealing with the engineering head, for example, or maybe it's a combination of a number of different roles. Also understand the people who will be finally using your product or your service on that site. You might have to engage with them as well as the people who make the final purchasing decisions. Understand the needs and the wants of all those different groups, and understand that your messaging, even though consistent, might have its language tweaked depending on who you're speaking to. If you're talking to an accountant, you're going to be talking money and bottom line and what the returns of investment are by purchasing from you, life cycle, time in market, etc. How you are going to play to reduce downtime, for example. But if you're talking to an engineer, you're going to be using engineering terminology. So make sure that you understand your customer. Also know where your customers get their buying information from. It might not be just coming from face-to-face meetings. Where else are they going to find information? And how do they finally make their buying decisions? In the case of buying decisions, basic things that apply across all products. There's need recognition. So your potential buyer identifies that there is a need for your product. How do you convince them that any need they've identified can be supplied by you? Information search. So how will people find your product? And how are they going to find it when they do? What is there when they find you? Evaluation and comparison. Any potential buyer is going to evaluate your product and they are going to compare it against other options. How does yours stack up? Vendor and product purchase decision. Your buyer is going to buy from someone in a specific place. How do they make that decision? And what does the supply chain look like? Where do you fit in? And then, of course, there's the post-purchase evaluation. Once a customer's bought something from you, how do you ensure that they keep coming back? Services are very similar, same basic principles, but in the case of services, you also need to make sure that you understand how you are going to deliver the service to your customers. And here, value proposition is really very important. Once your customers have entered into a contract with you, you then to make sure that that contract is ongoing and that it has longevity. And then we look at positioning. You need to understand your brand. You need to be very clear on what your brand is and what its positioning statement is. And you need to understand where you fit into the mining sector and where you fit into your customer's supply chain and what it is that you bring to the table. What is your corporate identity? You need to establish that, and then you need to know that your marketing statements accurately reflect that identity. You need to understand and you need to stand by your value proposition, and that determines your position in the market. And this is particularly important if yours is a high value product or service. If what you're selling is a collection of $10 widgets, probably not as vital for you to have that value proposition and to be able to stand by it. However, if what you're selling is a $100,000 piece of equipment, particularly if the competition is cheaper, you definitely need to know that value proposition and be able to defend it. And then finally, packaging. Now, if you were selling consumer goods, you would be literally talking about the thing that wraps around the consumer good. In this case, we're talking about the brand that wraps around your product and your service. And you need to ensure that it's the right brand for the market. Now, remember, your brand exists only in the way people perceive it. It really doesn't matter what you put out there. It's the way people receive what you have put out there. How your customer thinks and feels about your brand will have a huge influence on the success or failure of your business. You need to understand whether your customer will make a shift from audience to customer, and that depends on the perceived brand value. And then, of course, the all-important return customer. The better your brand is perceived and the better the brand reliability is, the more likely your one-off customer will turn into a customer for life. Let's look now at some of the marketing activities that you might undertake in order to promote your brand into a particular market. So here, these are all the things that you do to convey your marketing objectives. You have to make sure that any activity you undertake is tied back to your marketing mix and that it helps you execute your marketing strategy. You also need to have a budget, and you need to track your spend, and you need to track your activities against that budget, against your KPIs, and the return on your investment. If you're going to be effective, you need to isolate your marketing and communication problem, and you need to know how you're going to solve it. You also need to target the customer that you've identified. So remember, we talked about the fact that it's not necessarily a particular job role. It might be a number of different job roles. You need to have a very clear picture of the customer to whom you are communicating, and you need to target that customer. You also need to know how your activity meets your objectives. You need to design a proper media plan, and you then need to implement and monitor that plan. And that means you've got to formulate a messaging strategy. So for each market, and remember, every market is different, for every single product line, for every single service, and every marketing channel, you need to consider linguistic and cultural nuance, what's being marketed, the different users and the user experience, the specific media requirements in that market, the sophistication of the consumers in that market. And again, not all markets are created equal. Some mining customers are very sophisticated, very established multinationals. You might be aiming at the second and third tier of marketers, and those miners are not necessarily as sophisticated when it comes to their purchasing decisions. You also need to consider your own business priorities over time and the status of your marketing strategy, which you need to revisit on a regular basis. Now, there are push versus pull strategies. You either take the product and the service to the customer and you say, here it is, can I tell you about it? Or you pull the customers into you and they come and find out. So the basic difference is push is more focused on sales and getting to a quicker conversion, whereas pull has a more internal focus on existing customers and some new ones to create brand awareness so that leads start coming to you. Push is a mixture of offline, including customer visits, and online, like online advertising, and it's generally above the line when it comes to advertising. Whereas pull is mostly online, so you might have a blog, for example, that leads to a landing page, and it's usually below the line, which means it's a softer approach and it's usually related to public relations. So you might, for example, sponsor an activity in that market, a football team, for example, in that market, and that creates brand awareness and brand association. Now, all of this is moot if you don't have the right budget to spend or if you don't spend that budget wisely. And that also means that you need to be able to measure the effect of your spend. When it comes to marketing, you need to optimize your marketing budget or you will be wasting money. So always check your budget against your marketing strategy. Understand where you're aiming, understand what it is you're doing, and understand how the budget is tracking against that. Also, audit your existing marketing spend. Understand what the spend is and understand how much you're spending each month, each quarter, each year, and how that plays to the initiatives and the various markets in which you're active. And then evaluate how effective it is. And that means you need to set up some sort of analytics dashboard to determine the ROI for every market. If you're not accurate in this, you won't know whether what you're doing is effective and good value for money. And finally, if it looks as if you're spending too much, you probably are, and you need to rein in your expenses. Now, some hints for you to have some accurate budgeting. Always establish your sales cycle. If you know what your sales cycle is, you will be able to anticipate the strategies that you need to invest in and at which stage of the life cycle. The sales cycle in mining is long. No one makes instant purchasing decisions when it comes to selling into the mining sector. That means you need to budget to be there for the long haul, and you need to make sure that you have a consistent marketing drive and you eke out your budget if you need to. Also know what your outside costs are. You need to know what everything costs your business, and that way you also need to know what you can allocate allocate to marketing overall. You need to determine your goals. Once you know what you're trying to achieve, you can then set a budget that allows you to achieve those goals. And again, I cannot stress enough that you need to understand your market. You need to understand what the market requires of you to understand what you need to spend in that market to achieve your goals. Some markets are a lot harder to crack than others for a number of reasons, including that they are more competitive or they are more sophisticated and they have more established competitors already in that market. And those are just some of the reasons why they'll be harder. You might find that it's more difficult to crack a particular market because you can't use a specific marketing channel there. If a market relies heavily on your physical presence, that's expensive because you have to travel, you have to have accommodation, you have to spend time away from the business, etc. And of course, understand your strategies, what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why you're spending the money. And then finally, you need to measure for success. So what is the return on investment that you have? So return on investment measures the sales revenue that a campaign brings on every single dollar spent. So for example, you spend $1,000 on a campaign, that campaign generates $5,000 in sales, your ROI is $4,000 or 400%, which is great. Of course, it's not always quite that effective. And this is the same whether you are running an advertising campaign or whether you are running a campaign to go and visit your customers or a campaign to establish demonstration sites, for example. Then there's cost per win. This measures the expense of each individual sales. So Mary's example, if Mary's campaign resulted in 5 sales with a $1,000 budget, that's $200 per sale. And that means you can compare like for like. Then there's cost per lead. This measures the cost effectiveness of the marketing campaign in general. So again, that same $1,000 budget, if that same $1,000 budget generated 5 sales from 10 leads, that's a cost of $100 per lead. Conversion rate. So you measure your website's conversion rate, for example. The same thing should apply to any marketing campaign. So if Mary's $1,000 generated 1,000 visitors, and from each of those she got 1 lead, that's a 1% conversion rate. Incremental sales measures the contribution of your marketing effort towards your sales numbers. So if that $1,000 of Mary's sales were and generated sales $500,000, the campaign resulted 1% of total sales. And then of course there is the purchase funnel. You also need to know how many potential customers entered at the top of the funnel and how many finally dropped out the bottom, having been converted into customers. Very important measure for you is also your customer lifetime value. And this is where you're looking at an average sale per customer multiplied by the average number of times a customer buys per year, multiplied by the average retention. And again, remember, you don't have to take all of this in today. You can go through this at leisure when you get copies of the slides. It's quite difficult to calculate, time consuming, but it will give you a really good idea of how much it costs to generate your very best customers. And those, of course, are the ones you want to retain, and you want to be able to replicate that model. And finally, multi-channel funnels and attribution. You want to measure each campaign separately, each channel separately, but at some point there is going to be an overlap, and you need to understand where that overlap is and what that means for you going forward. Now, we've covered a great deal of ground. I'm sure by now your head is probably spinning with all the stuff that has been pumped into it. But I'm more than happy to take any questions if you'd like to type them in the Q&A box. And while you're thinking of what you want to do and what you might want to ask, I'm also going to get my camera to stay on. going to introduce you to my colleague Grant Philpotts, who's going to talk to you about what we've got coming up next and some of the other activities that we have with the Victoria METS Export Hub. So over to you, Grant.
Thank you, Collins. I've got a block on my camera, which is probably not a good thing, probably not a bad thing for people organising here.
There seems to be something. There's a weird thing with the video today. I don't know what it is, Grant, but I'll see in the meanwhile if I can get you to turn on. So you go ahead and I'll fiddle.
That's right. It's good that people can imagine anyway. It's often better than real life, I've often found anyway. So we have a number of events coming up within Austmine over the next couple of weeks. Primarily, Collins and I are doing a roadshow around Victoria. So we start off in Geelong next week. Then the week after that, we go to Ballarat and Bendigo, and then a week or so after that, we're down in the Latrobe Valley as well. So if you're interested in coming along and having some networking with fellow METS companies, that's always a good way to go. Again, the best place to look at is our website, because that's where everything is. As Collins is showing there, later tomorrow, goodness me, how's that? We've got our Peru Fresh Prospects for Australian METS, where our in-country consultant, Ricardo Labo, will be taking hub members and other interested parties through the Peruvian market. It's sometimes a hard one to get around with it. So that's interesting in the lead up to Peruvian as well. We've also got our Austmine GMG Forum coming up on the 17th and 18th. And we've got a number of other webinars coming up as well. The best place to check any of this information out, as always, is our website, because if you ring myself or Collins up to ask what's going on, that's the first place we'll be going to, is our website. So just go to austmine.com.au. You'll see a number of banners up there. Just click on upcoming events and go there. And of course, we can't forget IMARC coming up in November now, early November, and also A23, which is the Austmine conference coming up in sunny Adelaide, which will be a great place, because I think May it won't be so baking hot over there that'll just sap your energy out as soon as you step outside. So that's always important as well. So you have a look at IMARC and have a look at our Austmine 2023 series. And if anyone's going to Peru for Peruvian, please let us know, as there are things that we can do for our Victorian METS Export Hub members that is above and beyond what you may well get just by attending the event. So I'll hand it back to you, Collins.
Thanks very much, Grant. And indeed, all sorts of activities coming up. And remember, as I mentioned, this is the first in our marketing masterclass. 2 more after this. We're also going to be looking at digital marketing. So for those of you that might not be that familiar with digital marketing, we'll be giving you a bit of a primer. And then we're also going to be looking in more detail at establishing your brand, your METS brand in a new market. And that brings us to the end of today's session. It doesn't look as if we have any questions. So I think we'll call it done. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. As always, it's great to have your company and to see you online for these sessions. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop us a line. You will see my email address in the confirmation follow-up that comes after today's session. Feel free to send me any questions for future sessions, or indeed anything that you want to know about any of the other activities that we have at the Victoria METS Export Hub. Thank you, Grant, and thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next time round. And of course, next time round is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. when you can find out all about the Peru market. Until then, thanks everyone, and goodbye.